Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I have a really rock star lineup of panelists, so this is going to be a great morning. Again, I want to thank the World Food Prize Foundation, Kyle, and everyone who has put this together. Give them a round of applause, please. Let's get some energy going. Roundtable will focus on zeroing in on health and nutrition in the climate era, which sounds really intense and scary. So I'm glad I have this group of folks to talk to me about it. We will focus on nutritious food, making it more accessible, available, affordable, and equitable. And, you know, this is an issue that's more important than ever before because of the multiple crises we're facing right now. Of course, the climate crisis, our current public health crisis, the biodiversity loss crisis, our crisis in equity and racial discrimination and misogyny. These are all things that are coming to a tipping point, and they're affecting how we access and afford nutritious food. And obviously the conflicts that are going on in the world are having an impact on this as well. I spent last weekend at Ohio State University with Ratan Lal and Dan Glickman at a food tank event, and Dan said that, you know, even though he's been Secretary of Agriculture, he didn't really realize the impact that Ukraine had on the rest of the world. And if someone like Dan Glickman doesn't know, you know, how conflict is affecting nutrition across the world, then we do have a problem. And, you know, I think, you know, his comments really struck home to me because there are so many of us who don't know how complex our global food supply chains are and how fragile they are, and how that ultimately impacts whether all of us can gain nutritious food. So again, to explore these topics, I have a great panel. I'm going to start with the folks who are joining us virtually. We have Dr. Christy Eby from the University of Washington. Thank you so much for being here, Christy. We have Gunhild Stordelin from EAT. Nice to see you, Gunhild. Joining us in person, we have Ms. Hita Barnosky from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Thank you so much for being here. We have Christine Campeau, who I've known for a long time. I'm so happy to see, from CARE. We have Jennifer Krall at Bayer. Nice to see you, Jennifer. We have my hero, Dr. Lawrence Haddad of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. We have one of my heroines, Dr. Shakundala Tilstead of World Fish. We have joining us virtually, and I'm gonna mess it up. I've been practicing for days, and I'm still gonna mess it up. Dr. I almost had it. Govindaraj of Harvest Plus and this year's Borlaug Field Prize Award winner. We're so sorry you can't be here in person. I hope you're feeling better. And we're joined by Tambra Ray Stevenson of WANDA, which stands for Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. So a round of applause. We need energy this morning. I feel like we're all a little bit tired. So my first question has a couple of parts to it, so just bear with me for a minute. So I kind of want to let this, you know, set the stage a little bit. Nutritious food availability, affordability, and delivery is already difficult. We've been hearing that for the last couple of days, and it's happening in all parts of the world. The climate crisis, of course, is threatening this, having really devastating challenges on agricultural production and nutritious food security even further. Because this panel is focusing on nutritiously diverse supply chains, I want to talk about how the climate crisis is threatening public health and nutrition, and then what are the current and future health and nutritional risks of the climate emergency. So I am going to start with Lawrence, because I feel like you have a good grasp and you can sort of frame the discussion for us. I want to remind you of 3 minutes. I know it's hard.
You know me well, Danny. Thank you, thanks Danny, and it's great to be on this panel. Thank you for inviting me. When I think of and good morning everyone, and when I think of the impacts of climate on nutrition, it's easy to get lost in the weeds. So I'm kind of reductive in my thinking and exposition. So I think if there are three words that describe it for me. One is volatility, second one is safety, and the third one is density. So volatility, You know, farming is one of the most hazardous and difficult enterprises in the world. Farmers have to deal with tons of risks and tons of uncertainties, but climate change is just taking that to, you know, 10 levels up from where they are currently. And we know, and this is a big problem for food supply, food processing, food prices, input prices, child nutrition. We know that child nutrition, even 10 years ago, before climate change was the intense issue it is now. It was intense then, but it's even more intense now. Data from 10 years ago show us that the month in which a child is born really makes a difference to their birth weight, controlling for everything else, all the other factors. So this is a major problem. Volatility is kryptonite for the food system, absolutely. Food prices are all over the place. Farmers don't know when to plant. Processors don't know when they're going to get their stuff through the supply chains. Consumers are frightened by volatile prices. No one wins. Maybe a few speculators win, but no one else wins. So that's the first thing. Second thing is safety. And my colleague Delia Grace is always telling me about the important connections between climate and food safety. And forgive me for not getting some of the names right, Danny, but she's always telling me that even when food is not obviously lost, because this volatility generates food loss and food waste, but even when the food is not obviously lost, it can be unsafe. And so high temperatures, high rainfall is a big contributor to increasing levels of cholera, I can't say this, salmonellosis, thank you, and then the even harder one, campylobacteriosis. I got that one. So this is the safety is a really big problem. And food safety, we tend to think of mycotoxins, and they're of course very important, but it's the other types of food safety issues that really kill young children. And the third thing is density. We know that high levels of CO2 are reducing the nutrient density of staple foods. So how does this all add up? And I'll finish, Danny. How does this all add up? I told you about the variation by the month of birth in terms of child birth weight. But there's a paper done by Sylvia Blom and John Hoddinott, just came out from Cornell 3 or 4 months ago, that shows the impact of high temperatures in West Africa. They looked at 5 or 6 different West African countries. They looked at extreme temperatures, and they found that kids controlling again for everything else they could find to control for, stunting is 40% more prevalent, 40% more likely for these kids being exposed to these high temperatures. We don't know what the mechanism is yet. We'll figure that out, but it's a real big issue.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of that. And I want to come back to a lot of the things you said, but Christy, I want to turn to you. And Lawrence has brought up this issue of volatility, and I wonder what that means for a company like Bayer and how you address that.
So for Bayer,
yes.
On volatility, so when we look at volatility, I wrote resilience as the counter to that, right? And so how can we help our farmers be more resilient to these volatile swings that they're experiencing, whether that be increased rainfall and breeding for a rice that can be sustained being underwater for 2 weeks, like what we're trying to do in Bangladesh or have done in Bangladesh, whether that mean increasing the shelf life to help resist some of those changes in the supply chain, and really trying to work to increase predictability for farmers so that they know what to plant and when. I was with a farmer from Uganda last week, and I said, okay, if you picked one thing that would just unlock everything else in Africa, what would it be? And she said, just predictability with markets.
Sure.
If I knew what to plant when, she said everything else would come into play. The breeding would follow, the crop protection would follow, the regulatory environment would follow, everything. But if she knew what she needed to plant and when, then everything else would fall into line for her.
Yeah, but that's becoming more and more difficult for farmers. I mean, that predictability, they don't have it anymore. And we can get back to that. But I think it's such an important part of this, because farmers used to know when to plant. There was a day that they planted, there was a day that they harvested. That has gone away. And so I want to get back to that. Thank you for your answer. So Dr. Govind, which is what I'm going to call you now, if that's okay. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what both Lawrence and Christy have had to say about volatility and resilience, how do we counteract some of the things that we're seeing that the climate crisis is causing with creating, more resilience through crop breeding?
First of all, I'm pleased and thankful to World Food Prize Foundation for giving me the opportunity. All we know that, increasing the climate change and its vulnerability, especially for the crops and livestock, is very serious. Rising CO2 and climate change really is going to affect plant nutrition, human nutrition, and then thereby the entire planet. So therefore, the first and foremost, the group is vulnerable is the millions of smallholder farmers, especially in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, who is really contributing the major segment of the food production. So I see that they're already experiencing the pressure from the drought, pressure from the biotic stress, and various food price increases and commodity supply disturbances. So therefore, increasing CO2 as well as beside the increasing the temperature is going to be double burden in the crop production. So therefore, I see that the crops which are generally cultivated and the modern varieties is coming up is also losing its native nutrition. So therefore, as the GAIN director said, that we need to focus the nutrition aspect, along with the other aspect, because the nutrition is a key and going to not only affect the plant and also the human as well as the animal. So therefore, I see that the biofortified crops can slow down and some of this effect, which is bring the additional nutrition beside other resilient traits. So therefore, I feel that that could be one of the solution to slow down the effect in a vulnerable group, especially the smallholder farmers and the remote areas where the prediction, the advanced technology takes time to reach, to react, to address quickly. So if you see the CO2 increases and as well as the temperature increases, the additional micronutrient malnutrition population is going to increase more than 150 millions. And it is not only for zinc, it is also for iron and other vitamins. So this looks like, pretty serious. I think the research community is doing its best to address in a radical way. But however, the policy and the investment is the key, to accelerate the action and to save the time as well as the resource in a pooled manner, not in the scattered manner, so that we should not keep the duplicates for the same thing. So, but at least some strategy locally and some strategy regionally and some are across the globe, we need to devise in such a way. So therefore, what I mean to say is business as usual is not going to help in the quick shock period. So therefore, we need to come forward and pull hands and pull resources and take the replicated successful model in other places. So I feel that this is also important in terms of the gender, especially this effect, climate change effect is disproportionately felt by the women and girls. Why? Because who are the higher micronutrient needs and they lack equitable access to improved planting material and access to the finance for agriculture and access to the improved technology. So therefore, I see that there is a model, gains and harvest plus work together in some of the country in South Asia and also in Sub-Saharan Africa, scaling up the specific crop varieties and scaling up and mitigation strategy would help in this type of crisis time. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Govindaraj. You've said two key things that have stood out to me. The importance of women and girls when we're talking about this, and Samantha Power mentioned it yesterday, we ignore women and girls at our own peril. And this need to accelerate what we're doing right now because the urgency is so great. So I want to open it up for a few minutes to all of you to sort of talk about what you've heard regarding, this need for, what Dr. Govindaraj said about acceleration. How do we create resilience? How do we respond to the volatility that's out there? These are all things that are sort of, as I said at the beginning, coming together. And maybe, Gunhild, I know you think about these things a lot. Maybe I can start with you, and if you want to comment on what some of the other panelists have said.
Thanks a lot, and I'm really sorry that I'm stuck in a freezing cold Oslo and not able to join all of you in person. But anyway, great to be here, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. So I think what basically our friends and previous speakers have said is all boiling down to we really need to take a true systems approach to be able to tackle these interconnected challenges. And I mean, more of the same simply won't give different results. And we are in an more urgent situation than ever before, more complex. But at the same time, I believe that it provides us an enormous opportunity to really now get the true holistic food systems transformation that we need to see underway. And I'm simply thrilled to see that the Borlaug Dialogues this year is so much about the systems approach. And I think it's also really really important to acknowledge the immense opportunities we have to really build more resilience in the system, deliver multiple co-benefits by taking collective action. So very excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gunhild. That opportunity is key, looking at the solutions, looking at the opportunities. And Kahita, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but there are so many opportunities out there, and you're working on so many interesting things. I'm wondering if you can expand on some of what the opportunities are.
Yeah, there's a lot of small Indigenous projects going on right now that people aren't really aware of. And I work with the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society, and I know there's a lot of other Indigenous groups like that that are working on solving all these climate crises in their own way, on their own reservations.
Right.
Yeah. So.
And that community-centered piece of this is so key, especially when we're talking about Indigenous communities who have been using these practices for millennia, and now the rest of us are just noticing them.
Yeah, and the world has changed so much, but hopefully we can find ways to bring it back to how it was, because we can't keep going in the direction we are. No,
and those are the practices that work in so many ways. And I just going along with that theme, I wonder what your thoughts are about sort of regenerative techniques and how that term is now used, because it is using the same practices that Indigenous folks have, again, used for centuries. And whether that resonates with you, the regenerative term, or you would prefer something else.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a term. It's something that we've been doing for hundreds, thousands of years. You could call it whatever you want. But yeah, there's my people and other Native Indigenous people have been working this way for hundreds of years, and yeah.
And we lost those practices. It's time to get them back and get them more into the mainstream.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, there's a lot of projects that are working to bring back those old ways. Unfortunately, we have lost a lot of those ways since contact with the Western world. But yeah, I hope we can bring those old ways back.
Those real solutions back. Thank you. I wonder if anyone else on the panel wants to respond to what Gunhild or Kahita has said about Christine. You always look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on what Gunhild said, because for us at CARE, resilience is about building that social fabric within a community, and that takes planning together, tracking together, and fundraising together. And Gunhild, myself, Lawrence, and Shakantala were very honored last year to be part of an 18-month process called the UN Food Systems Summit. I know we heard a little bit about that in the opening discussion on Tuesday, but we haven't talked enough about that systemic approach. And it was super cool because you had Lawrence's track, thinking of it from nutrition. The track that Gunhild was leading was looking at consumption. You had the track that Shakantala and myself were leading was on advancing equitable livelihoods. And you had another track on climate change and one on risk. And we all, as we were walking through our tracks and really bringing in all the communities with us, we realized, wow, there's so much crossover between the work that we're doing. We should just be one track. We really do need to be thinking systemically. And as a result, we have 117 government national pathways. These are whole of government, whole of society pathways that are being implemented to really have this systemic approach that we need to really build on those synergies and minimize those trade-offs. And to me, that is what resilience is. And for CARE, I think the reason why this process worked over those 18 months is because people got involved because they felt like their voice mattered. I know we, as CARE, hosted 40 national dialogues, and within some of these, I'll give an example from Nepal, the marginalized communities were brought to speak to the government officials, and they said, we just need farmer ID cards. Like, how, this is so simple, but this would make a massive difference in our life. And it is. It's now in the national pathway, and now CARE continues to work with that government to implement that at local, federal, provincial level to really see that shift that we need. So we're bringing everybody along this transformation with us.
Yeah, that's key, to bring everyone along. Everyone has to be on the journey. Unless there are any other comments, I want to move on to the next question. And it's a two-parter as well, and I apologize that these questions are a little bit complex. It's about how we can increase the resilience of food system and other stakeholders to respond to global shocks. And I think this is key with what we're seeing right now and what we've seen over the last 2.5, almost 3 years. How do we leverage the actions to deliver health and nutritional needs to populations that have been historically marginalized and underserved because of inherent racism and again, misogyny in our food systems? And so, Kahita, I'm sorry to put you on the spot again, but I feel like this is your area of expertise. How do we, we've talked a lot about bringing those folks along on the journey, but often they're left out. Often they're not at conversations like these, and they should be. Their voices should be at every conversation like this one, but it's not easy.
Yeah, it's not. Thank you. Yeah, as a student whose expertise is specific to reviving extinct corn once grown by my tribe and work with the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society, I work hands-on with these system actors, as you call them, with the farmers growing corn in Nebraska and the researchers in the lab at the university I attend, and with the people of my tribe whom I share my food and my work with. And it seems to me that the westernized food system has isolated and specialized their approach towards food, and they're missing some key elements such as the social, spiritual, environmental, and psychological elements to nutrition. And all of these elements, Indigenous food systems do have at their core in some fashion. And unfortunately, Indigenous food systems with all these elements are not broad enough or stable enough right now to be a sole source of nutrition, at least for American Indigenous peoples, much less a bigger population. So they are at best a supplemental source, and therefore often sadly seen as a novelty. And I wanted to bring up, historically, there are a lot of Indigenous methodologies of nutrition that worked well for huge groups of people, but I feel that's kind of impossible to get back to, sadly, at least on a big scale in the westernized world. But I think there's a lot of Native American peoples post-contact hold a lot of examples to look at for responses that have been made to resolve crises and even food system shocks in the past. Most examples are what not to do, but there's still examples that should be considered because we don't want to repeat them, and often they weren't mended.
Right.
A good example of what should not be done is the Indian Relocation Act, which forced assimilation on Indian people, which most tribes failed horribly to adapt to. And we lost our ability to work our land and gather resources. And this led to the USDA commodity program, another example of what not to do, where Native American populations went from starving and dying to depending on those commodities and becoming obese and disease-ridden from that dependency. And the commodification of resources has led to a large decline in the ability for us to gather our own resources. And now the ability to make money off of those resources is more protected than gathering for food and health. And unfortunately, the spiritual, social, and psychological elements that are missing from these big-scale food systems do not make profits. So there isn't much funding or research or even awareness of other food systems and other programs that incorporate these values, such as Native American projects like the Pawnee Seed Preservation Society. So I guess to solve this problem, you have to decide if you want to make money and profits or if you want to make a change in the world. Change your perception for food systems, change the way you look at nutrition, and not just see food as a product, and change how you approach seeking solutions to climate change.
Thank you so much. That's really powerful. Yeah. Thank you. I think that funding and investment is key. I made a mistake before, so I just have to own up to it and correct it now. Jennifer is joining us in person from Bear. Christy Ebby is joining us online, so I'm sorry that I confused you both before. I'm tired. Okay. So, Christy, I know this wasn't the question that you were prepared for, but I'm wondering if you can comment on it a little bit, and I'll just, repeat. How do we, increase resilience to global shocks among food system stakeholders? And I feel like you're someone who has had a long time, sort of looking at these issues, and even though it wasn't the question I prepared you for, I'm hoping you can answer it.
Well, thank you, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to join remotely. And congratulations very much to Cynthia. It's a wonderful honor, a well-deserved honor. We're facing, as you've heard from all of the panelists, real challenges to resilience. And we need to be clear that it's not just climate change, it's carbon dioxide itself. And that we're unprepared for the impacts of carbon dioxide on all plants. The field work that's been done has focused on wheat and rice, but it affects grasses, it affects fruit trees. We don't have the research to understand how much the nutrient density of our food is declining already, and how we're going to be able to address that in the future. And as others have said, of taking this in a systems-based approach, of thinking of the impacts not just on children, the impacts on cattle, for example, on all of our livestock. There are so many different kinds of challenges we're facing. To increase that resilience, we need urgent investment in research. And we need to do this in partnership with communities to find out communities' concerns and to share with those communities what we're finding out about what we're seeing in the declines of the value, the nutritional value of their food. And working as well with various entities within governments, because of course, undernourished children are the next generation, will not then be able to contribute sufficiently to finding solutions as the climate continues to change, as we continue to face Earth system boundaries. So stepping back, seeing the holistic picture and finding ways that we can work together with science, with industry, with community to make a difference as we go forward into what will be a very different future. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And that collaboration is key for resilience. Jennifer and Christine, I want to turn to you to talk about this too, because, CARE and as a nonprofit, and then BEAR as a private sector entity, these collaborations have to take place, because if they don't, we won't get where we need to go. And I think that's something that I've learned over the last, bless you, 15 or 20 years, that if we're not talking to the private sector, none of these things will change. So I'm wondering if you can both sort of riff on that maybe for a few seconds.
Sure. So I really appreciate this thought of working collaboratively together across the system. And I think coming out of the Food System Summit, we had the Zero Hunger Pledge that Lawrence worked really hard on. And I think this is a great start and continuation of where we can go together. BEAR put forward a $160 million commitment with 100 million of that going towards vegetable seed breeding for smallholder farmers specifically. And we know that, you know, nutrition for smallholder farmers, and it's inextricably linked with their livelihood as well, right? That they have products that they can sell and market that will lift up them economically as well. And I was just listening to Christy talk, and I think so many times we've talked about farm to fork, you know, this concept of farm to fork. And I'm thinking that now is the time that we look fork to farm, right? So what needs to be on the plate, and not just on the plate, but consumed? How do we make it tasty, right? How do we make it shelf stable? How do we make it a more appealing end product that people want to consume, because it turns into nutrition only when it's consumed.
Absolutely.
Right? Not sitting on a shelf, not sitting on a plate. But how do we work together, fork to farm, to bring that holistic look to increase the nutrition that folks have available to them?
Absolutely. Christine?
Yeah, I had mentioned the food system summit process that we were involved in, and our focus, Shakuntala and I, was really on decent work and living incomes and wages for all food system workers, producers, fisher folk, transportation, processing, the tuk-tuk carrier, the vendor, absolutely everybody. And that can't be a conversation that CARE has on its own. That has to involve the private sector. And we've been very fortunate that a lot of private sector companies have come on board and said, yeah, we want to do better. Let's work together to get this better. CARE has been working historically with a lot of companies across the food value chain for a long time. And we just see that as the most progressive, honest way forward if we're really going to get these solutions that we need to happen.
Absolutely. Kudos to Jennifer for calling it, you know, vegetable seed breeding instead of specialty crop breeding, because if I hear that term once more, but those are not specialty crops, those are the crops that keep us nourished, and we forget that with all the focus on starchy stable crops. So again, I want to open it up to discussion from all of you, and Tambra just nodded at me. Go ahead.
Yes, first, thank you, World Food Prize, for the invitation to be a part of this dynamic panel. I wanted to chime in. At the work of WANDA, we center intersectional lens to the food system to ensure that if we want to advance food and nutrition security, we must unlock the inner food shiro in all of our women and girls, especially in the global south and in the diaspora. And in answering the question around resiliency, we as women, we are naturally resilient. When you think about what occurred in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, we've had to be lunch ladies, we had to be caregivers, we had to ensure that we had our own self-care. And it's so vitally important in understanding gender culture that we, in essence, unlock what is already naturally built within us to be resilient. And so much from the food system can be learned by what comes innate to us, as well as what we can teach others, and especially our young girls, the next generation, to understand that no matter what natural disasters come your way, that you have the ability to withstand any storm. And so the key part that we've learned in our work through our WANDA Academy, which was designing a digital sisterhood of safe space for women to be brave and connecting them to those who are women producers in their local communities, and to show that we're not simply consumers, is one, to acknowledge that we have part of resiliency is building strong communities. We've noticed in the midst of this pandemic that fragmented communities are not able to be resilient and sustainable. And so many people leverage digital technology, getting onto our social media platforms and building immediate digital communities that became a way to withstand this disinformation that was happening. But one of the concerns was the echo chambers that came about when you replicate negative energy, negative communication that reinforce this idea of what the conversation gets lost around evidence-based solutions around climate change and nutrition. And so to ensure that you have credible health, nutrition, climate experts in the midst of these communities become vitally important. And that's what we provided. people who look like them, women of color who are knowledgeable in their fields, who are educated, to ensure that we are able to combat any disinformation that is happening, to ensure that they're making smart decisions for their families. Because when they do that, we ensure that our food systems are only as strong as our communities and our homes and the women who are leading the change that we want to see in the world.
Thank you. It's so ground up. It's so inspiring, the work that you do. Yes, please. And that community connection and dispelling the misinformation is vital to all of this. And I think that's what we learned during the pandemic. That's what we continue to learn. So thank you, Tambra. Lawrence.
But did you want to go before me? Did you want to come in?
Dr.
Okay,
Schultz.
maybe I'll come in very quickly on the resilience private sector bit. Is that all right?
Of course.
Yeah. So just to conflate those two things for the minute, because first of all, private sector. What is the private sector? It's food and non-food companies. It's big mega companies. It's big national. It's medium and small. So it's really important to think hard about, when you think about the private sector, don't just think about Bayer. It's much more than that. And then, so 2 examples of how you promote resilience. Resilience is about maintaining functional capacity under extreme stress, at least for a while. You can't do it sustainably forever. So you have to, I think what we learned from COVID is you have to take care of people in the food system if you want the food system to keep functioning. So what does taking care of people in the food system mean? A couple of examples. One is, and Christine sort of mentioned it already, about decent work, decent working conditions, decent wages. And a big part of that is making sure that food system workers, they're really frontline workers in many ways, have decent nutrition. And there are lots of models. So any of you who employ people in Iowa, or the US, or in anywhere in the world, you should be running a workforce nutrition program for your staff. The benefit cost ratio is a 6 to 1. Every dollar, peso, rupee you spend, you'll get 6 in return. That's improved productivity, lower sickness levels, lower turnover levels, all sorts of things. So that's a really concrete example of a public-private partnership that will make food systems more resilient. Another example is small and medium enterprises in the food system. They really are the backbone of the food system, especially for those who are most vulnerable to malnutrition and climate change. But they don't have any capacity to weather storms, ride out fluctuations and volatilities. They don't have vast sums of operating capital to draw on. So again, they don't need handouts. They need loans. And,
Investment. They need.
So we, so again, public and the impact investing industry. Final point, Danny. 200 billion. The global. If you look at the global impact investor network data, 200 billion industry. 18 billion of that goes to Africa. 5 billion goes to food and agriculture in Africa. And I think we think about 200 million of that 200 billion goes to nutritious food for domestic consumption. So these are just 2 examples of promoting resilience by engaging with the private sector. The private sector hates uncertainty as well.
Sure. Shakunadola, I know you want to go next, but I want to push back, Lawrence, on this idea of, I thought during the pandemic that we would finally realize that the importance of those frontline workers, those food system workers, the essential workers who turned out, to be essential in some cases, but not essential in others. But companies didn't consider them essential. I don't think that the private sector is really investing in farmers or truck drivers or grocery store workers. And so it's nice to say, but they're not doing it. And so I don't know what we can say to this room, which is full of corporations that I admire and some I don't admire, how they can be part of doing that, how they can finally make that investment, because those are the people who kept us all fed during the pandemic and who keep their businesses going.
Well, can I respond?
Yeah.
If you want your supply chains to spring into action when demand picks up, you better make sure the people working in those supply chains are healthy and they're not absent and they're not. There's presenteeism as well as absenteeism. Presenteeism is when you're there but you're not really there. So if you want that to happen, and if you want some support to do that, shameless self-promotion point number 1, GAIN and the CGF, the Consumer Goods Forum, have a really good workforce program that will help you do that. You don't have to give us any money. We've got the money to help you do that. So it's important you do it in your headquarters, but it's even more important you do it with your suppliers and your value chains, because they're the ones that are really vulnerable.
Thank you, thank you. Shakuntala.
No, when I'll take another view of this, which we worked on when we were working at the UN Food System Summit. So Christine and I worked a lot with the people-centered approach, and we looked, ours was the only one that really started with the people-centered approach, the action track we worked in. But very quickly, we realized that there was a part of the food systems talking about foods that were missing. And we meddled into that and made sure that the action track 3 talked about nature positive foods, and one of the systems that they incorporated was about aquatic food systems.
Sure.
And I come from the CGIAR, where now we are beginning to work with aquatic food systems and combining water and land with aquatic foods, and also looking at how this has an effect on climate. And the evidence shows us that low trophic foods from water, both marine waters and from inland waters, that they are good for nourishing people as well as nourishing our planet. So that was one area Christine and I worked with, and we brought in seaweed into the debate at the UN Food System Summit, because we know that they have low carbon gas emissions. We also know that with respect to nourishing nations, they're extremely unique in delivering essential nutrients, vitamins and minerals, and essential fatty acids, which are so very important for the nutrients they bring to nourish young children, for growth, for development, and importantly, for cognition, and also for pregnant and lactating women. So therefore, it was important for us to ensure that the food systems transformation included not just foods from land, but also foods from water. And then we went back and looked at working with some of the private sector and looking at the supply chains, and working in Africa, looking at what kinds of products that can be used, because the most common food that they have from animal source foods is dried fish. And we looked at making chutneys for women, pregnant and lactating women, and dried powder that can be added to the complementary food of children. And we realized from the evidence that if we do that, that we would be promoting growth and development in children, and we would be creating women who would be healthy, well-nourished, and not just for themselves and for the child that they had at this particular time, but the effects would be intergenerational. So therefore, it was very important for us to ensure that in working with the Food Systems Summit, that aquatic foods, all aquatic foods, not just fish, but animals, plants, microorganisms were included. And the Scientific Advisory Committee to the UN Food Systems Summit identified 7 solutions for moving forward for hunger and malnutrition, of which one was sustained aquatic foods. So therefore, I do think that we should look, especially when we talk about now with the crises, school feeding programs,
Sure.
mother and child health care programs, we should use every effort to make these programs nutritious and sustainable. And this is one way we can do so.
Absolutely, and that connection between blue foods and terrestrial foods is so important and has been so ignored. So thanks to people like you and many others for really building that up and making sure it's at the forefront when we talk about these issues. So thank you. And that, and I think that sort of leads me to the open discussion question I want to ask, which is about resilience. Because if we don't connect blue foods and terrestrial foods and the intergenerational components of all this, then we are not going to have true resilience. And Lawrence had a definition of resilience that he mentioned before, but I wonder what true resilience means to all of you. And maybe we can start with Dr. Govindaraj.
Yeah, these Yeah, as mentioned earlier, this is, so if you see the call to action, and this very first we put that, plant first. So let us plant and in the sense crops, vegetables, or the animals. So let us do that job as that works to protect the planet and as well as the human. So therefore, we need to take care of what is the backbone of the food system. That should be the target of our action. So therefore, I see scaling of nutrition sensitive agriculture also is the training of the adaptive agriculture in terms of climate change and smart agriculture. So I see that many of the panelists agree, and they said, and the excellent technology with the wider partnership with the newer investment, I think we can collectively break the barriers, even the food crisis times or the pandemic's time, to achieve our target by 2030. Over. Thank you.
Thank you. Christy, your definition of resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd actually like to pass to Dr. Stortalin. She's been trying to get an intervention in for several minutes. So
I'm sorry, Gunhild, I can't watch everyone. So I'm sorry if I missed it. You're on mute.
Sorry, Christy, feel free to go first. I can jump in after you if you want to go. Okay? No, so I think when we are talking about resilience, and I love what you said, Shakuntala, about more diversity, and I think that is absolutely key. Obviously, we know that we need to shift to regenerative, nature-positive production, but more diversity in what we grow is also absolutely essential here. And I think that the pandemic, more than ever, and now with the war in Ukraine, has really showed how incredibly vulnerable we are. We are overly dependent upon a few global breadbaskets, and we are overly dependent upon a few crops and animal species. I mean, 75% of the world's food in terms of calories is currently coming from 12 crops and 5 animal species. And more of the solutions to building resilience is more local production for local consumption, and really diversify and decentralize our current globalized food systems, which does not mean an end to trade. We will still need that, but I think that is something that policies will also have to encourage. And then obviously we, as Lawrence spoke to, in terms of empowering the people working in the supply chains and also supporting SMEs, etc. And also for me, resilience is very much about the shift to healthy, nutritious and sustainable diets. And that was also a lesson learned from the pandemic, that healthy, or access to healthy, affordable, nutritious food is actually a resilience strategy, because except from age, dietary or diet-related diseases were the most important risk factor for severe outcomes and death from the virus. So it's really about thinking resilience throughout the system.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up diversification, and we've talked a lot about that this week. And we've talked a lot about diversification of crops and diversity of systems. But what I haven't heard as much, and that I'd like to hear from maybe Tambra and Kahita and anyone else who wants to jump in, is we also need a diversity of people who are involved in agriculture in different ways, and that is still not happening in a lot of parts of the world, especially here in Iowa. And so how do we include that diversity of people to create the resilience that Gunhild and others have talked about? Because if it's not there, we are not going to have the food system that I think so many people in this room want, one that is future forward thinking, that includes, both high and low innovations, that is creating nutrient dense and nutrient rich crops. So, Tambra.
Yeah, I want to open up with a quote from Norman Borlaug. He once said that almost certainly the first essential component of social justice is adequate food for all mankind. Food is the moral right of all who are born into this world. Yet, we know even today that more than half of the population still goes hungry, especially women and girls. I inserted that. Without food, man and woman can live at most but a few weeks. Without it, all other components of social justice are meaningless. And this is why the work of Wanda matters. This year we deployed, with the help of Food Tank, a State of Food Democracy survey that we asked, really, how do people see themselves as food citizens? The ability to participate in a food system and create the change that they want to see. We gathered about close to 1,000 responses. In our preliminary findings, we showed that, one, people believe that there should be a democratic collective action that speaks to not just simply voting for policymakers with midterm elections coming up here in the States, but actually every day you can vote with your fork. You can organize your communities. You can create petitions as we have. One of the questions we asked was, do you believe that there should be a food bill of rights? Which majority said, yes, we need a food bill of rights in this country, and it's something that could be adopted on a global level. Because when you have a unifying conceptual framework, it helps to guide the future of food and nutrition and agricultural policies that looks at the root causal issues versus a Band-Aid superficial solution to the problems that we have. One-off trick policies is not the answer to address a critical right of food that we all need to survive. And so this idea of even having local food policy councils is one mechanism, to Gun Hill's point, around how do we build local food systems and productivity, is by ensuring that we have mechanisms and infrastructure at place in our cities and our countries. Just like we in Washington, D.C., where I serve on our D.C. Food Policy Council, we have a mechanism to give voice to policy that we want our mayor to support. And if not, we will find other mechanisms to ensure through our council, through rallying, putting protests, marches together to ensure that our voices of everyday proletariat members are heard. When we do that, we ensure that true democracy rises because people have a choice. Grassroots and grass tops must be working together if we truly want to see a system change in our country and in our food system.
Thanks, Tamara, and I love this idea. Please.
Yeah.
Awesome. Tamara's my favorite person in this whole room. No, I love this idea of a food citizen, and we, you know, at Food Tank we call it citizen eater, but it's the same thing. And so, Kahita, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that and how, you know, Tamara talking about, you know, these grassroots efforts that need to happen and really influence the policy and influence the policymakers and decision makers.
Yeah, I think with grassroots, it starts with awareness. People don't even know these projects and grassroots things that are going on right now. And then it goes to like funding for these projects to get them what they need to change the world. And it also gets to education. And that starts with young people and even kids today. I mean, they see what's going on and all the stresses of the world today, and they want to help. And we need to, you know, educate them, show them like what they can do, because they can do a lot.
Absolutely, and that point about young people who want to be involved. I was talking to someone who's the mother of a young teenager last night, and I have a stepson who's 13. And they're scared. They understand that the climate crisis is happening and they want to do something about it, but they're scared, so they need that education. They need that awareness. It's really key.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think the next generation is key and paramount when we look at resilience, when we look at the future, when we look at the change. And I think you hit it spot on. I had a former colleague who said, young people don't want a seat at the table, they want to flip the table over, right? And when we look at agricultural practices, right, we see here in Iowa, less than 2% of our population is engaged in agriculture. The average age of a farmer globally is 60 years old. And when we look at the next generation coming back to the farm, particularly here in North America, they're looking at farming in a different way, right? They're taking a lot of different things into consideration than the generation before them did, because they have to, right? When we look globally, there's some institutional barriers to inclusion and diversity in agriculture, whether that be access to land, access to finance, access to markets. Particularly when we look at smallholder farmers, the majority of them are women, right? And you look at some of the cultural barriers that they face or the institutional barriers that they face that they aren't able to comprehensively contribute. And then you look at the barriers that young people face of getting into agriculture. Again, many of the same on access to finance, access to markets, access to land.
Sure.
And there's some fundamental barriers to entry that we really need to look at for the resilience of our entire agricultural system, of farmers having equal access to those things that they need to produce nutritious food in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We're going to run out of time, and I'm not going to get to all my questions, so I just want to move on a little bit here. So my next question, which we've covered a little bit already, but I do want to get to it, is, we're facing, again, a million challenges because of the climate crisis, but the public, the private sector, and our nonprofit sectors have not been good. We like to say that they've been good, but they have not been good about collaborating, and that needs to change. And so I'm wondering, how do we do this better? How do we make sure that we are all sort of talking to one another, that convening is happening, that we're all just, we're not paying lip service to it, which I feel like happens a lot. There's a lot of wishing that things will happen instead of actually doing them. And so Gunhild, I'm going to turn to you, and if you can maybe answer this in a minute or two, because I know, but this is something you think about constantly, and I know that collaboration with all of these different stakeholders is so important to you.
Yeah, and I mean, EAT from the very beginning has been all about getting these multi-stakeholder collaboration underway. And as Christine mentioned, we really came a step forward with the UN Food System Summit. I think the Food System Summit dialogues were really essential in giving birth to these national pathways and starting that the new collaborations and radical partnerships that we need to see. And I also do think that we need to really have these collaborations focusing on or targeting what matters the most. And that is about getting holistic strategies and food systems policies off the ground, both at the national and subnational levels, and really starting to align everything from agricultural subsidies to public procurements to taxes and fiscal policies, and obviously dietary guidelines, and having that all working together and reflecting the true value and true cost of food. And the second is that we really need to start talking about shifting capital flows, because currently food finance is grossly misaligned with the outcomes we need to see. And the third is really collaboration for that public demand and getting that groundswell to happen, because policymakers basically know what to do, but just not how to get re-elected once they have done it. And private sector obviously need regulations and predictability to be able to make a profit within the system. And at EAT, we are really focusing on two things at the moment. One is to provide the science and help define and update targets aligned with 1.5 and the SDGs and with EAT Lancet 2.0. And all these collaborations, of course, must be science-based. And the second is what we are talking about here, really that coalition building and the movement building. And Christine mentioned also the collaboration. We have set up something with the Action Track leading organizations and C40 called the Food Forward Consortium, which is all about supporting cities in driving demand and connecting them to rural regenerative landscape initiatives. And the second I would like to mention is the Good Food Finance Network, which is all about catalyzing a similar shift that we have seen in energy. Any investor you asked will know that the future of energy is renewable. But if you ask an investor what that means for food, it's much more vague and confusion. So it's really about creating that mindset shifts and also the financial instruments and even crystallizing a mechanism for how do you ensure access, and a co-investment platform is currently being worked on and discussed to ensure that. So it's all hands on deck, and thanks for giving me the final chance, Danny. Over.
Thank you. It is all hands on deck. Thank you. And I'm so glad you brought up shifting food finance. That is such a key part of this. And I, from my perspective, from somebody who is in the nonprofit world, and it was part of the UN Food System Summit process. you know, it's been so widely criticized by others in the nonprofit community, but Gunhild, you pointed all the good things that came out of it, and I want to keep re-emphasizing that. So, okay, it wasn't perfect, but all of these great collaborations came out of it that will be, you know, will change things over both the short and long term.
I do think, and also which we tried hard with the UN Food Systems Summit, was to have a people-centered approach. It was called the People's Summit. How well we lived up to that, that's another question. But we really tried hard to have a people-centered approach, where for me it was simple that if we take care of people, we take care of the people, their families, their children, then they're the stewards of the planet. And then we can also get the care of the planet. So, and I do think, and when we talk about people, it's not just the small-scale producers, it's across. And I think we will reach much further if we will begin with consumers and work our way back, rather than always beginning with the producers and the inputs to produce.
That's such an interesting point, beginning with eaters instead. Yeah, I like that. I like that very much. So, you know, I think sort of this idea of collaboration, you know, we've talked about it all week again. I want to know, Tambra, how does that work when, you know, there's so many, and I'm just going to be very blunt, when there's so much racial and gender inequality that's going on that we have still not addressed. It's very hard to collaborate when you are discriminated against, dismissed, you know, not brought to the table, not at conferences like these.
Yeah, first, I want to acknowledge that in the Afro-American church tradition, we have a song and phrase, keep your eye on the prize. And when we do that, we ensure that the people don't perish because we have a vision. And when you focus on the vision, you can overcome any adversity, any difficulty, because you know that any test that comes your way is a test of how strong are you convicted to the cause to achieve the goal that you have at hand. And so when I think about collaboration, I think I translate all the language into the language I know through culture, which is the village. And so we have a character, Little Wanda, and Little Wanda is our centerpiece that we think of and say, how do we ensure that Little Wanda can grow up to be that healthy eater, reader, and food leader that we need in the world? And when we think about all the village people that are needed, whether they're bringing their own diversified superpowers, that is how we can think about what does she need as she traverses her community, going from school to her home. What are the advertisements that she sees? Is it promoting healthy food or not healthy food? Are there community gardens in her neighborhood? Does she have access to healthy food in her community in terms of the grocery stores and as well as the farmers markets? Is she able to grow food in her own home, on her balconies, if she doesn't have a land? And so what are the messages being reaffirmed in her schools, through her teachers, through her parents? Are they telling her that you don't want to eat the carrot, it doesn't taste good? Or are we saying, like, don't blame the veggie, blame the cook, learn the skill, and therefore the carrot can taste great? I mean, who hasn't had a carrot dog? And so that is what I center on. I think being trained in communication and understand the power of imagination, I try to reimagine the world that I wish to be in. And I call upon all of us when we are dwindling in pessimism and Debbie Downer kind of negative Nancy worlds, continue to focus and say, can I plant hope? Hope for me is helping other people every day, but it also is having optimism, perseverance, and enthusiasm on life. Pull the weeds of doubting other people every day. Plant those seeds that will bring forth the fruit that we need for others to thrive. When we do that, we're not focused on simply concerned if we're going to be on the menu, will we have the seat at the table, because we're building our own table factory, and we can produce all the tables that we want. That's about shifting our paradigm and how we envision the world and how we position ourselves. Be the food hero that you need in order for your communities to thrive. When you unlock your superpower, everything around you change. Your energy will bring forth the vibrations that's needed to bring forth the food that we need in our communities.
Thank you, Tamara Ray. Christy, I want to go back to you and give you the final word on collaboration. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I just want to make sure that you can talk about the collaboration that is needed to build resilience, to build a better food system that we've all been talking about this week.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the key point on the collaboration is, as everyone else has said, to have all the key partners at the table and to do it in the context of a changing world, that the plans need to be resilient, take into account the significant changes we're seeing in terms of the climate, in terms of nature, demographics, socioeconomic, and have vision for how to move through this complex landscape to a future where everyone has a safe planet, has just access to the resources, to the food, to the energy they need. And we do, as others have said, need all hands on deck, and we need to work together in that kind of environment. And the dialogue here is a place to get that started. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great point to end on. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for being here and listening.